going to be unfair because I didn't actually ask this gentleman whether we could actually ask him or not. But Simon Foster, I knew.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. So the City of London is a globally important hub for financial trade, which generates significant surplus and services and is an asset to the British economy, inward investment and so on. How would that be protected in the case of Brexit?
Rupert, given your background, you want to have a first shot at that one?
Well, I was rather looking forward to answering the other question, but...
There'll be time coming back to those.
Well, I think the answer to your question is if you look at what the European Union has been trying to do to the City of London, which, as you quite rightly say, before our own regulators are having a bit of a crack at it at the moment, as you probably know. But it is a fantastic place to do business. Most people, and you've probably seen HSBC are going to have now decided to stay in London. I think that's because London is a good place to do business. It's a great place to raise money. I mean, personally, I have no fears of Brexit on that score. I think the city, if you want to come into a financial centre in Europe, will remain as a preeminent centre, even if we do exit. And when people say exit, it's not exiting. As I say, we're right next to Europe. We're part of Europe. There is a difference between having a sovereign parliament in Westminster and becoming part of a European superstate. Don't confuse that with trade. Don't confuse that with the City of London. The City of London is a great place to finance things. It's a great place to do business, and I have no fear for the City of London. I mean, Frankfurt was at one time, had we voted in 1987 for the euro ultimately by de facto by supporting one of the parties without forcing them to have a referendum, all our gold and reserves would have been shipped off to Frankfurt, and Frankfurt might very well have become a financial centre of Europe. But no, we are, Chinese banks come into London, they don't go into Germany. London is the most international part of Europe, and it would remain that way whether we were in or out of Europe.
Dr. Key, from an economist's point of view?
Yes, and I did work there many years ago. The point about the city is a global financial centre, so it's not just about Europe. And I actually share Rupert's view. It's so innovative, it's so special. It's more than banking, it's insurance, which is my field, it's metals exchanges, commodity exchanges, it's stock markets, and all the various services and specialisms that support it. So I'm actually not too concerned about the city and its ability to innovate and adjust to whatever the context is. So in terms of the specifics of the city, I'm not too concerned about that. But what I'm concerned about, which actually perhaps connects to the earlier question, is the terms under which perhaps the city and other parts of our economy trade with Europe. Certainly the new music I'm doing in preparing for this is that one of the things that the EU, is we have to think from the EU's point of view, if they gave us a very good trade deal in whatever area, financial services or other parts of our economy, then they might be setting a precedent. Because of course there is a lot of disquiet in Europe, there's a lot of concerns. Some of our students today come from different countries. I'm talking to a German student. In Germany there is not equanimity about this. There is a lot of debate, a lot of disagreement about the future of Europe and where it's going to go. And for me, the real reason to be part of Europe is to ensure that the European country that's been described doesn't happen. Nobody wants that. But nobody wants that really, I don't think, in Europe either. I do think this is a kind of a straw man argument. But certainly from the city's point of view, I don't see the city being particularly threatened if we're in or out, because having worked there, and I'm sure one or two other people have, and I see Rupert has, it's unique. It's a thing that when I talk to my students about, people think the city is similar to what was on in Frankfurt or New York or Chicago or Shanghai or Hong Kong, and I'm sure Justin knows it better than I. It isn't. The city is a unique institution. It's globally in perspective. It attracts the best from around the world, and whatever the EU does, I'm pretty sure the city will adjust.
Dr. Zhang, certainly from a Chinese perspective, there's been a lot of interest in China in the service industry, particularly financial services. If Britain was outside, would that make any particular, they'd still need access to those sort of markets, wouldn't they? Those London particularly centred markets.
Yeah, I think, for us, I think UK staying the EU definitely is a lot more attractive for us as investor. And I think in terms of, like Dr. Kim said, draw the talents into the city. I mean, if you're outside of the EU, and when we lose that free of movement in terms of, talents from other European countries as well, and certainly, we have students coming here to study from other parts of EU countries on Erasmus program as well. If we're outside of EU, we will lose all those funding from European Union. And I think that's definitely is not going to be very attractive. That's my view.
Okay, let's move on to another question then. Tom, over to you.
Given that the UK is one of the leading foreign policy powers in the EU, what influence, if any, would the UK have on EU foreign policy and security matters if we exit?
Okay. Alex, you want to have the first shot at that one?
Well, I think the bottom line is, of course, if we do exit, we're going to have a much more modest impact. That's right. But I personally believe that the main levers of British foreign policy remain, first of all, our membership of NATO. I think that's at the cornerstone of our defence, and that will remain the case. The fact that we remain a permanent member of the UN Security Council. And I don't think, whether we stay in the EU or not, I don't think we're going to have any truck with any notion of a European army or any of that sort of thing. So, of course, it's true that we wouldn't have so much influence in respect of EU foreign policy. But actually, as far as I'm concerned, I don't think that really is going to be, has ever been the cornerstone of our foreign policy in any event. So, modest but not significant.
Okay. Let's pick up on that one as well. Rupert?
Well, I agree with Alex.
Okay.
Well, I
Any
can't
other
be
variations on that? A unanimity. Right. Well, let's have another one, yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, my question was really about the accession of Turkey to the European Union, because Turkey's already on track. It became an associate member in 2005. It's got borders with Syria, Iraq, Iran and so on, and a population of 78 million, projected to be 83 million in a few years' time. So what do the panel think about Turkey becoming a full member of the European Union? Do they agree with it? And what do they think the ramifications are for the UK?
I've never thought that Turkey would be allowed to join. I always thought that just politically they would be allowed to be the buffer. And so I don't know if that's going to happen, but that's what my instinct has been, that they would separate Europe from the rest.
They're on track to join currently, 10 years down the track. So
hang on, we can rest and start here. So they're on track. So therefore, what happens? Do you think they should continue? In fact, they've got a little enclave in Europe.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult. I think it's very difficult given the geography of Turkey.
Okay. Alex, do you have a view on this one? Alex Jones?
Well, Turkey's obviously currently the place where the vast majority of Syrian migrants are residing. So in the short term, it's worrying. In the long term, I'd expect some kind of resolution to have come by in 10 years when they're expected to join. But my question would be, where would the European border end? Is it a federalist expansionist policy where we're just going to continue expanding indefinitely? And if there is an end to it, where is it written down in any part of the Constitution?
Alex, how far does it actually go?
Well, look, this is a really, really important issue. I mean, speaking for myself, I don't think Turkey is ready to join the European Union. I can't see that in the near future. But look, let's be clear about it. Turkey is in a very difficult situation at the moment, and whilst I'm not suggesting it's going to be a failed state, it will continue, I'm sure, to be a good functioning democracy. It has real difficulties, but the point you're really focusing on, if I may say so, is this issue about the security of the European Union's borders. And I think a lot of people in Cheltenham and elsewhere have a real concern about the extent to which Europe can properly guard its borders. And if Turkey is part of it, it makes it even more difficult for anyone to have any confidence that those borders are secure. And of course, once people are in Europe and they have free movement, then that can impact upon us in the United Kingdom. And that really is at the heart of a lot of people's concerns.
But not just Turkey. I mean, almost de facto hearing people saying that Ukraine is almost another border state which is going to absorb. Do you think that would have a similar issue for us?
Well, absolutely. Look, it goes without saying, every time you expand the European Union, it's this issue of free movement, which means that you take on, as it were, additional liabilities. But the fact is, whether you have Ukraine, whether you have Turkey, you've got a situation where in Greece, which of course, fully fledged member of the European Union, where because of the concerns about its ability to guard its border, that there's a sense that the free movement principle causes, as I say, implications elsewhere in the European Union because there isn't that clear border. And that only becomes more acute, some might say, as soon as you start adding additional states like Turkey and Ukraine, particularly if they have porous borders themselves.
Christina, do you think a country like Turkey at some stage should be able to join? Or just it's beyond it?
Well, I think it's as it's a question that was raised by Alex when he said, where does Europe end? I mean, it does look rather silly that I think it's something like 3/4, if not more, of Turkey actually sits in Asia. Their culture is certainly, their history is very different to ours. So working together with them, I can understand, but doing that separately as independent peoples, rather than them trying to become absorbed. And they are a lot of people. So I think, certainly in the foreseeable future, I would hope they are not going to be joining the European Union, because I don't think they have the same cultural background which would allow them to easily fit within the European Union. And as Alex said, the borders are so difficult now to control. I was reading something recently that suggested several of the states are actually sending troops to border Greece, the northern borders of Greece, to actually stop all the people who are coming up through Greece getting further into Europe, into their particular countries. Now, you know, the European Union's foundation about free movement of people is already under threat. To absorb that many more people, I think, no, certainly not in the short term.
And what about something like Ukraine, where you've actually got people actively talking about Ukraine being absorbed, or whatever's left of Ukraine anyway?
Well, Ukraine's a whole new issue, and I think that also shows up some of the lack of thinking that goes on in Europe, because it was almost inevitable that if you start to threaten Russia, they're going to react. They are not going to sit passively by while NATO marches up to the border with Russia, nose to nose, and particularly when you've got the Mediterranean fleet sitting in Ukraine. I don't know how they came up with the ideas that they did. And so I think the problems in Ukraine were, to a degree anyway, caused by the actions of the European Union.
Well,
Rupert, have you got something about that?
well, I do. I think the Turks are very fine men, but at the end of the day, it's part of the problem of Europe. And again, in 1986, there were 12 members of the European Union. Most of them effectively had a similar standard of living and a similar culture. There are now, I think, 28 members when Croatia joined. And again, if Turkey were to join, we create this major problem, particularly as I mean, in answer to your question, that the plan was a European superstate, is the answer to your question.
Thank you.
And the plan in the European Union, in the superstate, the post-war plan, was free movement of peoples within that state. And ultimately, if Turkey were to join on that basis, we would have a major problem. So whilst I think the Turks are very fine men, I personally am in favour of immigration in a responsible and professionally handled way. I don't always trust our government to manage things particularly responsibly or well. They can't manage the passport office. They find it very difficult to distribute agricultural subsidies, which should be relatively straightforward. But I would hope that if we were to take back control of our own sovereign parliament, we'd boot them out if they didn't do the job properly, and they would at least have the opportunity of controlling immigration and managing it in a sensible way, because I agree with Alex. Good, properly managed immigration is effectively great for growth and great for the economy.
Okay. Anybody want to add any further points on that one? Others will press on. I'd like to ask Philip Cole. Philip Cole, know that? Yes? You had a very good question on sovereignty and herons.
Yes. First of all, a spoiler alert, like most people here, I'm biased.
You have a view.
Yes, I'm the chairman of the local branch of Britain's Sovereign Europe. I also belong to the European movement, and I retired not so long ago after 25 years working for the European Parliament. I was head of the English and Irish Translation Service. But to get to the question, given that sovereignty is a pointless red herring in my opinion, and predictably Turk and Kipper is here fishing the herrings. Given it's a pointless red herring, let's be honest, which arguments do you think will actually persuade floating voters in the referendum, regardless of your own views about EU?
All right, Claire, let's start with that. What would you as a floating voter?
I'm a floating voter. I guess I'm a bit old-fashioned. I tend to think that it's better to be at the table and be able to be part of those negotiations. I think the floating voter who's listening to those of you who are floating voters out in the audience this evening, who are listening to the various debates that are going on, it'll be interesting at the end when we ask for a show of hands how much this debate has swayed people one way or the other. But I I just genuinely feel that we need to be at the table to have those conversations. If we isolate ourselves, you know, do we lose our power? I think it would be lovely to go back to the days when we had India and, you know, we had this wonderful coverage across the globe, but we haven't, sadly. And we've only got, I've got the quotes here, that we've got 1% of the world's population. That's less than 3% of the global income, GDP, and that's shrinking every year. You know, we haven't got a voice if we're on our own, or there's a fear as a floating voter that we haven't got a strong enough voice if we're not at the table. So I think that is going to be the thing that will tip people one way or the other, is that fear of being isolated. Stay part of it because they're too scared that if they step away from the table, they're going to lose that voice. That's what I feel as a floating voter.
Yes, you probably saw me nodding there. This was my favourite question, actually, Philip. So this is because as I do think it's a myth. I wrote the word, and a colleague, when we were talking about this earlier, wrote the word isolation rather than sovereignty. It is in my view, a myth in the global world we're talking about. And as my colleague was talking about earlier, you know, that the Chinese and the Americans have said the EU, UK should be part of the EU, and if they're not, we will treat them differently. You know, we're not sovereign. We can't necessarily negotiate all these great trade deals with 50 countries that we'd have to if we came out.
So it's more of a negative than a positive.
Well, no, it's a myth. It's a red herring or a myth. I mean, we're in a global world. We certainly have a sovereign identity. I see myself as a Yorkshireman, an Englishman, a European, a man, all those kind of things. But have I got sovereignty? Of course not. I'm interconnected, and the world is very interconnected. So when I saw this, I was thinking about Norway's sovereignty, which is a myth, Switzerland's sovereignty, which is a myth. Our sovereignty outside of the EU is a myth, and what we need to recognise is that we have the risk of saying, as the fifth largest economy in the world, we can negotiate with power and authority. The Chinese and the US are saying we can't. We don't have the sovereignty we think we have. We don't have the power that comes from that sovereignty, and we need to debunk ourselves of this view.
I'm afraid I don't accept the premise of the question. Of course it's true. There is no such thing as absolute sovereignty. We're a member of NATO, therefore you cede sovereignty. We're within the United Nations, therefore you cede sovereignty. But to suggest that it makes no difference to our level of sovereignty whether we're inside the European Union or outside the European Union, with my respect, I would respectfully say is specious. Of course it would mean more sovereignty. Now you can have different views about whether that's a good thing or bad thing, but of course it would give us greater power over our destiny. But in answer to your question, the key things I think that will make the difference: one, the economy. Are people going to be more prosperous in or out, I think, is the first thing. The second thing is going to be immigration. Do people feel they're going to have greater control or sufficient control of borders? And then the third thing that I think will come up is this issue of funding. How much does it cost us to be in? And people will say, well, it's £1 billion a month or whatever. I don't think that will be the issue. But the two primary ones will be the economy and immigration.
Okay. So, I was going to say, Christina, have you got any particular points there?
I would agree with what Alex is saying, because I don't think sovereignty is a red herring. I think many people don't think about sovereignty particularly, but they do think about their power to make decisions through their elected representatives. And it's no good at all to pretend that if we cede yet further powers to Europe, again, those we've already given, then obviously we are going to be less sovereign than we currently are. So I think in terms of sovereignty, it is important to decide who makes your laws, because if you don't have control of those people or their ability to make laws by being able to deselect and not elect them, then you don't have much control at all over what's going on with any spending, any taxes, any obligations which are put upon you as a citizen. I think, though, that the things that will affect people's decisions are exactly as Alex said. I think it's going to be the cost of our membership, and that's in terms of also the physical cost, the cash cost, if you like, but it's also in terms of the ability to say who can and who can't come into this country, under what conditions they can stay here. So I think it's about controlling our borders, it's about controlling our budget, and actually saying, over the last Parliament, we put in, the government put in something like £31 billion worth of austerity cuts. Actually, during that same time, we have given £86 billion to the European Union. So you might say we could have reversed those cuts and not had any at all, and invested that extra money in our own infrastructure instead of which.
Mark, what are the key arguments that sway the vote?
Well, yeah, in terms of answering the question as I heard it, I think I can perhaps summarise what we've heard by saying that our journalists and our politicians will select those messages that play either to our fear or to our greed, and I think that's really what's been said.
Mm-hmm. So on that basis, but what's the bit that you think is really going to persuade people one way or the other, or do we have to leave it to Robert Preston?
I think it is those two things, the economy and immigration. I think will really be the things that tip people one way or the other.
Yeah. Anybody want to add any more bits on that one, Rupert?
The actual numbers are £350 million a week goes out to the EU, 150 billion over the last decade, and over £500 billion a week.
A week.
Per week. Enough to build a hospital every week. The answer. Well, firstly, like Alex, I disagree that sovereignty is a pointless red herring. That is patently nonsense. But at the end of the day, the key issues, I think, are the economy and obviously immigration. Now, immigration, I think, is a fear for the working people of the country as much as anybody, not the elite. And ultimately, whilst I'm in favour of planned and organised immigration, I think that may well be the main issue which people ultimately vote on, depending on when we have the vote.
But some of the figures we had today showed that there was a distinct shortage of labour for key working areas at the moment.
Well, that's because we have our own currency and a vibrant economy, which, and again, somebody said if we're part of Europe, we're going to prosper. Well, if you tell that to the French, because they're not prospering, and you tell that to the Greeks, they're not prospering, or the Portuguese, or the Spanish, or a lot of the other people who are fully part of the euro, ultimately that is going to be the issue. I think the answer to the question is immigration.
Alex, well, that was the figure going out. What was the sort of net figure of money?
Yeah, I would be, if it, when I come to make my decision, I'll be extremely dubious about these issues of how much one puts in, because you can create any statistic you want. You could say 350 million a week, but that doesn't, of course, take account of the fact we got a whole load of rebates back. At the end of the day, I personally don't think this should be the clincher decision. Even if it's £12 billion a year that we spend, put that in context. We spend as a nation something like £740 billion a year. Now that 12 billion, if it puts us into a club where we think overall we're more prosperous overall, then that 12 billion is something that we should wear. The real issue for us is, does being in the European Union cause us to be more prosperous overall, so that actually it generates a whole load of tax revenue? This business about our subs for joining should be, I think, a peripheral matter. In fact, I suspect it will be used by the out-and-out Brexiters to be a key one. But what we should focus on, I think, is what's the cost-benefit analysis for our economy, and to what extent can we properly maintain control of our borders. Those should be the issues.
Okay, I think we've fulfilled our quota on red herrings tonight. That's limited anyway. So can I please ask Christoph Pertzer?
It was partially answered, but I'm still going to answer. Roughly 50% of the foreign UK trade happens with the EU, give or take. How does the panel see that impacted if the UK opts out of the European Union?
And can we ask where you're from? Germany. Right, okay.
I think in the short term we'd see very little change, particularly from a manufacturing perspective. Large plant and equipment, trained people, established presence, those things are quite difficult to move physically. But I do think that in the longer term, investment behaviours would change. Investment committees aren't patriotic. And so I think that if we were outside of Europe, UK boards would be looking to invest plant and equipment, new facilities within the European market to benefit from that. And I do think, as our colleague here said, that non-European inward investment to the UK would significantly reduce, because they would look to establish a presence within the European market itself.
And so 2 years ago, we were the third largest inward investment nation in the world.
Yeah.
Since then, that has dropped off significantly, and the feeling seems to be on the basis to make up our minds whether we're going to be in or not.
Yeah.
Do you think that's going to now going to be actually people will be driving investment elsewhere?
I think that's right. I do think that's right. And as I said, it's not, investment isn't patriotic. It seeks the best returns, and I think that would be a very significant worry to me.
Chinese investment has been quite significant, and there's obviously a lot more coming through.
Yes. I was talking to some local businesses last week at the Growth Hub in our Oxtel campus, And from those businesses who does import and export business with other EU countries, and they definitely said it's going to have huge impact on them if UK is out of EU. And hundreds of technical and legal and bureaucratic barriers have been removed, abolished after UK joined as part of EU, because it's an internal market and single market. So I think it will cost a lot more to local businesses, especially those small and medium-sized enterprises, because these are the companies don't have much more money to spend on actual administrative sides and things. And and these businesses actually really contribute to UK economy and employ local peoples, and they pay tax to UK government. Unlike those multinational companies, and they make profit in the UK and they bring profit back to where they are from, and a lot of them don't pay proper tax. So I think definitely it's going to have a huge impact to local businesses.
There's one particular question I think it's quite a more parochial question, but one that is uniquely British, I think, and this is from Jane Foster.
If we exit the EU, how is that going to impact the Northern Irish, Southern Irish issues? Can it inflame the problems, and what will they do about the borders coming and going?
Yeah.
And given our colleague over here obviously had a similar connection obviously with Ireland as well, I suspect there was some other issues to come out. So the Irish is, and this actually would expand this also to Scotland as well, because Scotland made it very clear, as far as they're concerned, they wish to be in, no matter what's going to happen. So how would we address some of this, Alex?
Well, look, I said at the beginning that one of the really compelling reasons, I think, for those people who want to stay in, and something that weighs heavily with me, is the impact potentially on our United Kingdom. The thing that's very important to me is our UK and the integrity of the UK. And I think probably it would bring about the end of the UK, and I think Scotland would get a second referendum and it would be on its toes, it would be off. And so to that extent, I think that's probably the single biggest concern so far as the United Kingdom is concerned. Yeah, I mean, in terms of looking at the Northern Ireland situation, we're not in Schengen anyway. I don't see that actually in and of itself would be spectacular. I think it would be eclipsed constitutionally by the fact that Scotland would be out and the United Kingdom would unravel, and that's an issue which weighs heavily with me.
Anybody else wish to make a comment on this?
Many of us know that would technically, we're not an island in that sense, because we'd have a border then with the EU. But as Alex said, for me, the bigger issue is that obviously the Scottish National Party made it very clear that if we were to exit the EU, they might see that as a good reason to have another referendum. And we know how close it was last time.
Sorry, we can't. We can't hear you, sir, I'm afraid, with that particular one. The point was we don't know the answer to that.
We don't.
No. Well, we could also adopt Mr. Trump's view and just build another wall, I suppose. Let's take some questions from the floor, please.
Yes, my name is Adrian Phillips. I've lived in Cheltenham on and off for about 25 years. If you have a difficult decision to make, it's always a good idea to seek the advice of your friends. So in all other 27 EU nations, the presidents of the USA and China, Prime Ministers of Australia, Canada, India and others, and the Secretary General of NATO, all advise the UK is better off inside Europe, but Vladimir Putin would like us to leave. Whose advice should we listen to? Right.
I think listen to whoever invests more in this country.
Yeah, I would say the same, yeah. Yeah, I'd back you up.
At the moment, definitely, yeah. We have invested quite a lot, yes.
Maybe worth remembering as well that our economy is actually 40% larger than the entire Russian economy as well. So next time he's having Curtis on that.
We are more friendly as well compared to And yeah, we have a lot more Chinese students here studying at university, and I can't see any Russian students here. So in terms of UK economy, I think bring the Chinese in, and we do contribute a lot towards the UK economy. Yeah, and we're friendly people.
Yeah, I think that there are several issues at play here. First and foremost, having worked in the business world for a lot of years, most businesses are, how can I put this, rather selfish in fostering their own interests. They don't really care where they do business as long as it's profitable. One of the things that we have to recognise is that last year the European economy grew by about 1%. However, the economy in America grew by 3%. In Asia, it grew by 5%. So where are people going to invest? They're going to invest where there's going to be a good return. So I think we have to think that through, as well as saying, by being in Europe, we'll be stronger. Not necessarily, I don't think. I think the other thing that we need to be thinking about, when we're talking about the breakup of our European, of the UK, Scotland will make its own decision, irrespective of what we do when we have the national, if we do get it, the national referendum. And I think in terms of where we're going as a country, we have every prospect of being extremely prosperous and of working with China. There's nothing stopping Chinese students coming here to learn. No one's proposing if we leave the EU that would happen. All of these things which are being raised, they are red herrings, actually. They're not part of what this debate should be about. This debate really is about who makes the decisions. We decide who comes here under what circumstances, or does someone else? And our trade deals benefit us. They're not something that's a conglomerate for 28 countries sort of pushed together to actually make a whole.
Don't you want to miss something if the Australians, the Americans, the Indians are all saying...
No, I don't. No, I don't. Because I would think it rather disrespectful to actually tell the Americans who have an election coming up this year that they should vote for the Republican or the Democratic candidate.
I made a bit of a boob on that. I suggested that Donald Trump was a buffoon, so I've intervened. I'm in big trouble in the United States, so I'm really hoping he doesn't get elected.
I thought you were describing his hairstyle.
You probably are right.
Yeah, there is that.
I think the point is that it's actually for those countries will express an opinion, and let's be very honest about it. They're not going to think of our interest first, they're going to think of their own, and maybe they have friendly relationships with people here which are driving some of their thinking and some of their public statements. But ultimately, that decision isn't being made in America, should not be made whether Russia is pro or anti, or China is pro or anti. It should be made on the basis of what the British people believe is better for them. And that's really what this debate should be about.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.